I've seen way too many people go for the cheap, budget PTZ that looks good on the box, only to end up wrestling with choppy tracking, laggy outputs, and a focus that never quite locks on the subject. The regret shows up a few minutes into a live stream when the camera can't keep up and the whole production feels amateurish. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So the question I keep hearing is, does the PTZOptics Move 4K actually feel like a smarter buy, or is it just another pricey gimmick? First off, the biggest hurdle for anyone new to PTZ gear is the learning curve. You've got a handful of buttons, menu layers, and a slew of output options that can feel overwhelming if you haven't set up a multi-camera rig before. The Move 4K tries to smooth that out with a fairly clean on-screen menu that groups the most used settings: resolution, frame rate, and auto-tracking onto the top tier. You don't have to dig through endless submenus to enable the auto-track. It's a single tap. That's a real time saver when you're live streaming a conference and need to switch the focus from a speaker to a panelist on the fly. Speaking of auto-tracking, that's the headline feature most people care about. It uses the built-in camera sensor to lock onto a subject and keep it centered as they move. In practice, I tested it during a 3-hour workshop where presenters walked onto the stage, stepped off, and then returned later. The camera held the face lock with minimal jitter, and when the presenter stepped out of frame, the auto-track switched to a preset PTZ position instead of just freezing. It's not perfect fast. Erratic motion can still lose the target for a split second, but for most speaking engagements, panel discussions, or classroom recordings, it feels reliable enough to let you focus on content rather than camera control. Now, let's talk about the output options, because that's where the Move 4K really separates itself from the cheap PTZ crowd. It gives you SDI, HDMI, USB, and IP streams all at once, which means you can feed the same 4K signal to a hardware switcher, a laptop for OBS, and a remote streaming service via NDI without any extra converters. In a real-world scenario, I set it up in a small church where the worship team wanted to stream to YouTube, record locally on a dedicated capture box, and also send a clean feed to the house's projection system. One cable from the HDMI output went to the projector, the SDI went to the capture box, and the IP stream fed the OBS instance on a laptop. Everything stayed in sync, and there were no dropped frames even when I switched the camera's pan tilt zoom during a song. Low-light performance is another frequent point of hesitation. PTZOptics aren't typically known for night vision capabilities, and the Move 4K is no exception. It uses a 1/2.8-inch sensor with a decent amount of gain, so you'll get usable footage down to about 0.5 lux. In a dimly lit interview room with just a couple of softbox lights, the image stayed clean with only a slight grain that didn't distract from the subject. If you're planning to shoot in a theater with spotlights or a dark warehouse with minimal lighting, you'll probably need to add a dedicated light source or consider a camera with larger sensor technology. One practical weakness I noticed is the lack of built-in stabilization. Because PTZ cameras rely on precise motor movements rather than sensor shift, any rapid pan can introduce a subtle shake, especially when the zoom is cranked in. For static shots or slow pans, you won't notice it, but if you're trying to capture a fast-moving speaker walking across a stage while zoomed in, the image can get a bit jittery. The workaround is to keep the zoom moderate and let the camera do a smooth, longer pan, or use external software to add a little digital stabilization in post, though that can reduce sharpness. Battery confidence is often a silent concern for creators who need to run a camera for hours. The Move 4K is powered via an AC adapter, which means it's not truly portable on a battery pack. That's fine for a fixed installation like a studio, classroom, or conference room, but if you were hoping to take it on location for a pop-up event and rely on a power bank, you'll be out of luck. You could technically power it with a 12V DC source, but you'll still need a reliable power solution. So, for anyone who needs true mobility, this isn't the camera you're looking for. The lens ecosystem on PTZOptics is fairly standardized. The Move 4K ships with a 12x optical zoom lens that covers 19.5mm to 234mm, 35mm equivalent. That range is versatile for most indoor productions, wide enough to capture a full room, tight enough to get a close-up of a presenter's face without losing detail. The lens also has a decent manual focus ring, which comes in handy if you want to lock focus on a static set piece and avoid the